So I want you to imagine treating the highly complex, massively intertwined global economy um, like a simple vending machine,
Oh, boy.
right? You just walk up, you punch a button, feed $1 billion of government spending into the slot, and expect a perfectly predictable $1.3 billion of GDP to just drop into the tray below.
I mean, it sounds completely absurd when you put it like that.
A child could tell you the real world doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But, here's the wild thing. This is exactly how some of the most influential financial models operating today actually treat the economy.
Yeah, it's this highly mechanical, almost robotic assumption, and they apply it to a deeply organic, unpredictable system.
Right.
And when those models dictate the fiscal policies of entire nations, that disconnect becomes pretty dangerous.
Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at this quiet yet massive intellectual crisis happening right now inside central banks and finance ministries worldwide.
Because the tools they use to predict the economy are fundamentally broken.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds of how this happened, I really want to introduce the researchers behind today's source material who are actively trying to fix this.
Yeah, they're doing some really vital work.
They really are. The Better Policy Project is a macroeconomic policy center located in Lisbon, Portugal.
Right.
Our main mission is to improve the effectiveness of public policy via 3 avenues: raising public economic literacy, improving analytical frameworks in policymaking bodies, and enhancing the communication of policy to the public.
It's a huge undertaking.
Absolutely. We model, develop, and teach state-of-the-art frameworks for monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential policies. And real quick, if you like what we are doing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment.
Yeah, feedback is really important for us, so leave us your questions and thoughts.
Welcome back to the Deep Dives. Today, we're unpacking why the macroeconomics models used across central banks and commercial finance are facing an intellectual crisis, and why Douglas Laxton started his crusade to fix them.
Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Doug was the projection coordinator at the Bank of Canada, managing massive, old-style macroeconometric models. He famously described trying to use those reduced-form models for policy decisions as trying to make a dinosaur jump through a hoop.
It took a staggering amount of overtime for the team just to keep the equations from spitting out absurd results, because those legacy models relied on historical correlations rather than fundamental causation and completely lacked forward-looking expectations. They produced spurious, illogical outcomes.
That's why Doug led the effort at the Bank of Canada to put those dinosaurs to bed by developing a new generation of structural models, starting with QPM, before moving to the IMF to build Multimod and FPAS.
The fact that commercial risk teams and policy institutions are still using backward-looking reduced form engines today, purely due to regulatory inertia, means they've ignored 50 years of economic science. It's time to demand better.
It really is. I mean, we just can't keep doing this.
So how exactly are modern centers of finance falling into this exact same trap today? I mean, how are we still here?
Well, it really comes down to a phenomenon called mission creep. And specifically, we're talking about the misuse of QPMs, which are quarterly projection models.
Okay, break that down for me. What is a QPM supposed to do?
At its core, a QPM is a parsimonious, transparent tool. It was originally engineered strictly as a thermometer for monetary policy.
Just a thermometer.
Exactly. Its job is just to track the output gap, inflation trajectories, and, interest rates. It gives central banks this really clear, common language to organize their forecasts.
So if it's a thermometer, it's measuring temperature. But just because you bolt a weather vane onto a highly calibrated thermometer, it doesn't mean it's suddenly the right tool for meteorology.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't ask a thermometer to predict the wind speed.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Because QPMs are so accessible and they've been so historically successful at tracking inflation, bureaucratic pressure just mounts to make them do things they were never designed to do.
Like what?
Well, economists are pressured to bolt these ad hoc fiscal blocks and mechanical debt rolls directly onto this monetary thermometer, all just to evaluate complex government spending and taxes.
Let's look at a concrete example of this in action today. Consider the August 2026 IMF working paper on monetary fiscal policy interactions in Korea, working paper number 26145. They attempt to evaluate a fiscal expansion by adding a discretionary primary deficit term directly into a quarterly monetary IS curve.
Which is crazy because the IS curve essentially just maps how interest rates affect total economic output. Jamming a raw deficit number directly into that equation is incredibly reductive.
When you inspect the math under the hood, the structural flaws are striking. The model uses an autoregressive 0.8 lagged output gap parameter without forward-looking agent optimization.
Right, which basically means for anyone not speaking advanced econometrics, the model assumes 80% of whatever happened to the economy last quarter will automatically just carry over and happen again this quarter. It completely ignores how human beings actually plan for the future. So when a permanent 1% of GDP fiscal deficit shock hits, quarter one shows a modest output gap response of plus 0.26%. But because that 0.8 lag parameter carries 80% of the previous quarter's gap forward, the output effect compounds quarter after quarter. 0.26% in Q1, rising to 0.47% in Q2, 0.64% in Q3, and 0.7% in Q4.
And as you move into year 2, year 3, and beyond, the output gap stays permanently stuck near plus 1.30%. That makes no economic sense.
Yeah.
An output gap measures temporary business cycle slack. It cannot step up and remain permanently elevated at plus 1.3% forever simply because a government ran a deficit.
It's an unanchored mathematical artifact of a 0.8 AR1 lag. The model treats all fiscal spending identically, ignoring whether it's spent on productive infrastructure, untargeted transfers, or corporate tax cuts, while completely missing trade leakages.
This mirrors the famous historical critique of Lawrence Klein's early reduced form structural models during the Project LANK era. Klein pointed out a major paradox in how central banks approach inflation.
Right. Klein argued that during supply shocks, blindly hiking interest rates to curb inflation can actually backfire. Raising interest rates increases working capital borrowing costs for businesses.
If firms treat interest as a cost of doing business and pass it to consumers through higher markups, the rate hike produces a short-run cost-push inflation spiral. It proves that linking macro variables without understanding firm behavior and expectations leads to unreliable policy predictions.
Yeah, I mean, when you just link a deficit to an output gap using a rigid mathematical multiplier, you are fundamentally ignoring the actual economic science of how humans and businesses behave in the real world.
Okay, so if linking variables blindly fails so spectacularly, how are central banks supposed to measure the real impact of a deficit? Is there, a better way to calculate this?
There is. And the alternative was actually laid out back in 2012 by a landmark multi-institution study. It was led by Gunter Konen.
Oh, right, the Konen benchmark.
Exactly. They compared structural models across major policy centers and completely refuted the idea of a single hard-coded fiscal multiplier.
They just threw the vending machine model right
Out the window. They established 4 fundamental principles of fiscal transmission that explain exactly why that old model is totally broken.
Okay, let's explore these 4 principles because they seem crucial to all this. Principle 1 is instrument non-equivalence.
Right.
I'm guessing this means $1 billion isn't always $1 billion. If the government spends $1 billion building a massive new bridge, it permanently improves transportation and commerce.
Correct. It creates real, tangible productivity.
Yeah. But if they use that exact same $1 billion for a tax cut to a handful of billionaires who just park the cash in a savings account, the economic impact is completely different.
Radically different. I mean, building a bridge expands public capital. A lump sum tax cut to wealthy savers barely moves the needle on short-term demand.
Right.
But a generic QPM treats both of those billion-dollar deficits as mathematically identical. The model just sees the dollar amount.
Wow. Okay, so what's principle 2?
Principle 2 is the critical role of monetary policy accommodation.
Meaning basically how the central bank reacts to the spending.
Yeah, exactly. If a government aggressively stimulates the economy, but the central bank gets spooked by potential inflation and immediately hikes interest rates, they make borrowing much more expensive.
Which crowds out private investment.
Right, effectively killing the stimulus. But if the central bank holds rates flat and accommodates the spending, the stimulus actually thrives. A single hard-coded multiplier just assumes the central bank doesn't even exist.
That makes total sense. Okay, principle 3 is trade leakages. I imagine this is a pretty massive blind spot in our globalized world.
Oh, absolutely. If a country spends billions to stimulate its economy, but uses that money to import, say, steel, concrete, and technology from abroad, that stimulus instantly leaks across the border.
The money was spent domestically, but the real economic boost happened for their trading partners.
Exactly. A simple model sees domestic spending and just automatically assumes domestic growth.
Which brings us to principle 4, which is labor market slack.
And this one is really all about timing. If you inject government spending into an economy during a recession, when unemployment is high, you mobilize idle workers. You create real value.
Right, because those people needed jobs.
Yeah. But if you dump that same amount of money into an economy that is already at full employment, there are no idle workers left to hire.
Oh, I see.
The government just ends up cannibalizing the private sector. They poach workers by offering higher wages, which just creates inflation rather than new physical output.
So, okay, if a proper model needs to capture human behavior like saving versus spending, and whether the labor market has any slack left in it, how do we actually compute that without reverting to those dinosaurs Doug Laxton was fighting?
Well, we rely on micro-founded structural frameworks.
Right.
A prime example of this is the Global Integrated Monetary and Fiscal Model, or GIMF for short.
GIMF. Got it.
Yeah. Instead of looking at aggregate math, GIMF looks at granular demographics. For instance, it separates households into two completely different behavioral categories.
Let's break those categories down. What's the first one?
First, you have liquidity-constrained households, which are known as LIQ. These are essentially your hand-to-mouth households. They have no meaningful savings, no real access to credit.
So if the government gives them $1, they spend that dollar instantly on rent or groceries.
Exactly. Their marginal propensity to consume is exactly 1.0.
Right, okay. And the second category?
That would be overlapping generations, or OLG. These are your forward-looking savers.
Meaning they don't just spend whatever they get.
No, not at all. If the government gives them a lump sum cash transfer, they don't immediately run out and spend it. They hoard it.
Why do they hoard it?
Because they optimize their spending over their lifespan. They understand that a massive government deficit today just means they are going to face higher taxes tomorrow.
So they basically save the transfer to pay the future tax bill. I mean, that makes intuitive sense.
It does.
How did these nuanced demographic models perform in the real world compared to the simple ones? Let's look at the historical case study the sources point to. The massive 2009 to 2010 G20 stimulus response to the great financial crisis.
Oh, it's a perfect testing ground. Because different regions deployed totally different tools.
Right.
The U.S. relied heavily on targeted transfers to those LIQ hand-to-mouth households, plus infrastructure. The Euro area leaned on automatic stabilizers. China mobilized a massive direct public infrastructure campaign.
And the structural models could actually parse all of this out. So what did the data actually reveal?
It revealed something incredible about what happens at the zero lower bound.
Okay, the zero lower band. Explain that.
During the crisis, the Federal Reserve dropped nominal interest rates flat to zero and just kept them there. Because nominal rates couldn't go any lower, but people expected inflation to eventually rise, it drove real interest rates into negative territory.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking the causality there. The real interest rate is basically the nominal rate minus expected inflation, right?
Correct.
So if the nominal rate is zero and expected inflation is positive, the real cost of borrowing money becomes mathematically negative.
Yes. Borrowing became historically unbelievably cheap. And because the central bank accommodated the stimulus in this way, it essentially doubled the first-year GDP multiplier for public investment in the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah, it jumped from 0.98 to 2.18.
So every dollar the government spent on infrastructure generated over $2 in economic activity, purely because of the unique way the central bank behaved.
Exactly. And it also proved that targeted transfers to those hand-to-mouth LIQ households produced multipliers 3 to 4 times larger than untargeted transfers given to general OLG savers.
That is wild. But, the G20 stimulus works so well because there are idle factories, unemployed workers, and a central bank keeping rates at zero.
Right.
But what happens if you reverse every single one of those conditions? What if you dump massive amounts of money into an economy that is already completely maxed out?
That is the absolute nightmare scenario for the vending machine model. And it brings us to the second major case study from the sources, the post-2023 Euro area defense expansion.
Okay.
Following some major geopolitical shocks, we saw a massive 1.2% of GDP injection into European defense.
But unlike the 2009 crisis, the European economy wasn't sitting on massive unemployment.
Not at all. And the structural models track this specific transmission across 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 is import leakage.
Import leakage.
Yeah. When European nations quickly bought off-the-shelf defense systems, like U.S.-made F-35 fighter jets, that money instantly left the domestic economy. The initial domestic multiplier was heavily suppressed, sitting around just 0.35.
Because buying a jet from America doesn't stimulate an aerospace factory in France.
Exactly. Then we hit phase 2, domestic ramping up. The military eventually shifts to building armored vehicles domestically and aggressively recruiting soldiers. But unemployment in the euro area was already sitting below 6.5%.
Which the sources identify as the NIRU limit, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the economy's absolute speed limit before things start breaking down.
Yes, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Because there's virtually no slack left in the labor market, the military has to poach civilian workers and engineers by offering significantly higher wages.
And that sends unit labor costs surging across the entire economy.
Which triggers phase 3, ECB crowding out. As those wages surge, non-traded service inflation reaches the 2.7% target anchor, shooting up to 4.2%.
Wow.
I mean, imagine you run a mid-sized logistics or manufacturing company in Germany during this phase. You want to expand, but your engineers are leaving for defense contractors, so your payroll costs skyrocket.
Right.
At the same time, how does the European Central Bank react to 4.2% inflation? They slam on the brakes, they raise interest rates, making borrowing incredibly expensive.
So not only are your labor costs up, but you also can't afford the loan you needed for a new warehouse.
Exactly. Private businesses across Europe are forced to cancel their expansion plans because they simply can't afford the capital.
Leading to phase 4, a permanent structural shift. The government ultimately gets its tanks and jets, which provides the necessary security. But private civilian output is permanently lowered because private capital was entirely squeezed out.
And this is a textbook example of why the single multiplier model is so dangerous. If you just plugged a 1.2% defense deficit into a simple QPM, it would predict a massive boom in GDP.
Right. It would totally miss the import leakage, the aggressive wage poaching, and the central bank's reaction, crushing the civilian private sector.
It would miss all of it.
You know, there's a fascinating paradox in the sources here regarding the 3C framework, the idea of comprehensive, consistent, coordinated allied spending.
Oh yeah, the 3C framework.
My instinct says allied coordination is a universally good thing. Like if all NATO countries spend together, we lift all boats, right?
Well, in a deep recession, yes, coordination creates positive demand spillovers. But the sources highlight a critical bottleneck when economies are running hot. If every NATO country coordinates to demand the exact same rare earth metals, the exact same radar semiconductors, and the exact same specialized aerospace engineers at the exact same time,
They aren't sharing demand. They are colliding headfirst with a hard physical supply wall.
you don't magically get more output or faster production just because everyone is spending at once. You just get massive cost markups and extreme supply chain bottlenecks.
So the coordinated spending basically creates rampant inflation rather than actual physical security infrastructure.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've outlined the intellectual crisis, we've seen how dangerous these flawed models are, and we've explored how complex real structural transmission actually is. What is the practical solution? How do central banks and finance ministries actually fix this?
The Better Policy Project outlines a highly disciplined 4-step protocol to fix this intellectual surrender. And the core philosophy is straightforward. Get QPMs out of the fiscal business.
Okay, let's put this into practice to see how it works. Let's role play a bit.
Sure.
Let's say I'm a finance minister, and I've got a massive new green energy initiative, $100 billion. Under the old vending machine model, I just plug that $100 billion into the QPM, and it spits out a predicted $150 billion in GDP growth.
Yep.
How do I apply these 4 steps instead?
All right. Step 1 is disaggregation and accounting. Basically, I tell you to stop looking at the headline deficit number. We break your package down into its primitive parts.
So looking at where the money actually goes.
Right. How much of that $100 billion goes to importing solar panels from overseas? How much is targeted tax rebates for low-income households? How much is long-term domestic grid investment? We have to know exactly what you are buying before we can predict what it will do.
Like going to the doctor. They can't just weigh me and prescribe medication based on my mass. They need my blood pressure, my cholesterol, my specific symptoms.
Exactly. So then step 2 is off-model multiplier assessment. We take those disaggregated components and run them through proper structural models like DIM or empirical local projections.
Finding the real multipliers.
Right, based on who is actually getting the money and how the central bank is poised to react to your specific spending.
And step 3.
Step 3 is the supply and potential growth assessment. This is about determining if the spending alters the long-term economic speed limit.
Speed limit. What do you mean?
Well, building a modernized national power grid increases the entire economy's productivity for decades, right? The speed limit goes up.
Hmm.
Handing out a one-time cash bonus for buying an electric bike does not. We have to assess whether the potential output of the economy has structurally shifted.
That makes a lot of sense.
There.
And finally, step 4, conditioning and fiscal reporting.
Yeah, once we have done all that rigorous, structurally sound homework, we take the well-researched net demand effect and plug it back into the QPM as a transparent judgment term. We let the QPM stick to what it is actually good at, tracking automatic stabilizers using OECD's cyclical elasticities and predicting the monetary policy response.
We don't ask the thermometer to predict the wind speed. We use an anemometer for the wind and hand those specific results to the forecaster.
Exactly. It's a suite of models approach. Each mathematical tool is strictly assigned to the specific task it can actually perform credibly.
So why does all of this matter to you listening right now? Because understanding this gives you an absolute superpower. You are now the ultimate lie detector.
Truly.
The next time a politician gets on the news and claims a massive deficit package will magically boost the economy by X amount, you know exactly what questions to ask. Who's getting the money? Are we buying imports? Is the economy already maxed out? You know that the headline number is almost always hiding the real mechanics of the story.
You know, connecting this to the broader systems governing our world, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
We saw how Lawrence Klein's project LENK failed because they assumed adding more equations meant a better model. We've seen how bolting features onto a thermometer ruins the instrument.
Right.
If the most rigorous, highly scrutinized central bankers in the world can fall into this trap of mission creep just to satisfy a demand for an easy, all-in-one answer, think about the other systems in your daily life.
That's a chilling thought when you consider the tech sector right now.
Oh, absolutely. Are we suffering from the illusion of completeness everywhere? Think about the frantic rollout of do-everything AI tools that promise to write your code, offer medical advice, and manage your schedule all at once. Are we just bolting weather vanes onto thermometers and blindly trusting them to predict the future?
That is something to seriously think about the next time you see a single algorithm promising to solve every complex problem. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying mechanisms, and remember, the world is way too complicated to fit into a vending machine.
Right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
If this discussion has you thinking about how fiscal policy should actually be incorporated into macroeconomic models, there's a lot more we'd like to show you. This December, the Better Policy Project's Global Forecasting School is coming to Prague for our flagship executive workshop from December 7th to 11th. We'll go beyond the issues we discussed today and work through how to build policy-consistent scenarios in practice, from prudent risk management and FPAS scenarios to using a suite of models and applying 3C growth strategies to help economies escape low productivity traps. The focus is practical, real-world scenario analysis, hands-on case studies, and tools you can actually use in policy institutions. If you'd like to join us in Prague, contact Asha Kostanian at the email on screen to reserve your spot. We'd love to see you there.